In the 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower amended the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag to include the words "under God." So if no one has any objections, we're going to include those two words tonight. I'd ask you to stand and face the flag. If you can place your right hand over your heart, and even though I don't think anyone's in uniform tonight, if you prefer to salute, that's very acceptable as well. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
I'm just going to adjust this. Can you hear me well? Okay. Welcome. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Donna Colorio, and I am a former school committee member in Worcester. In addition to serving on the Worcester School Committee, I've been an adjunct professor at Quinsigamond Community College and a Massachusetts Teachers Union member for the past 22 years. I am a mother of 3, and my youngest is still at home, and she attends a Worcester Public School, and I am furious. I have been working with Common Core for the last year and a half. In March of 2013, I was at home trying to understand what Common Core was. Now, some of you, Common Core may have just been something you just heard about recently. How many here just heard about Common Core in the last, say, month or so? Okay, thank you. The more I read, the more I became concerned, worried, and outraged. In fact, we were at a meeting just with Sandra and Jamie about a month ago in Northborough, and a parent had come for the first time to understand what Common Core was. I saw her 10 days later, and I said to her, "So what did you think?" She said, "After hearing Jamie and Sandra, I haven't slept since." At that time, I called a colleague of mine and asked if she knew of anyone in the state of Massachusetts that could come and educate maybe a dozen of us, of concerned parents, about Common Core. The name that was given to me was Sandra Stotsky. When I called Sandra, she said she felt that in order to come, she'd like to see about 100 plus in attendance. I said, wow. So I agreed, and I began to plan a forum at the Worcester Public Library, inviting everyone and anyone I knew. Surprisingly enough, this was last year in May, we had 125 in attendance. And after listening to Dr. Stotsky, I was convinced that Common Core needed to go. Common Core standards are a one-size-fits-all educational standards for K through 12th grade in English language arts and math. These standards are unproven, underfunded, and untested. I'm here to tell you that Common Core standards are going to turn the classroom into a testing environment instead of a learning environment. Common Core standards are not an education reform, but a radical transformation from classroom instruction. Simply put, the Common Core is designed to replace local and parental control over education with centralized top-down control. The purpose is to train students for jobs, not to educate them to be full, thoughtful citizens in our democratic republic. Common Core standards are not state-led. They were created and funded by special interest groups. States were strong-armed into accepting the Common Core in lieu of grant monies and waivers at the time where states were cash-strapped. Parents, elected representatives, school committee members, and teachers appear to have been largely bypassed. Tonight, you will hear from 2 experts explaining why Common Core standards are wrong for Massachusetts. We did invite the Department of Ed also to share their side of why they implemented the Common Core standards without any representation from the state. And as you can see, they're not here. We needed people, we invited the Board of Ed because they were responsible for implementing and accepting these standards along with the governor. Each guest will speak for approximately 20 minutes. Does that sound about right? And then I will take questions from the audience. So limit your questions to about 30 seconds. I then will close by talking about a new statewide group that's forming to oppose the Common Core standards and what you can do as a parent, educator, grandparent, or taxpayer to help. I hope to be finished by, I'd say, 8:45. So let's remember that Common Core is not a right or a left issue. It is a right and a wrong issue, and Common Core is wrong. Our first speaker is Jamie Gass. Jamie is Pioneer Institute's director of the Center of School Reform. At Pioneer, he was framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K through 12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as a senior policy analyst, technical writer in the state budget office under 2 Massachusetts governors. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the Dean of Brown Boston University School of Education, Boston University management team in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on various local and national media outlets. He has been quoted in The Economist, Education Week, and the Boston Globe, and he has op-eds are regularly published in the Boston Herald, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, and other regional newspapers, as well as national op-eds and magazine articles in the Wall Street Journal, Education Next, and City Journal. Jamie speaks on academic standards, school choice options, the school accountability at events throughout the country. He has earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from Boston University. It is with great pleasure I introduce Jamie Gass.
Thanks so much, Donna, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I think it's, 10 degrees above zero, so spring is probably arriving sometime soon. But I want to thank Medway Matters, too, for setting up this event. Increasingly, we are seeing more and more events like this in Massachusetts. Sandy Stotsky and I have been doing a lot of work in about 20 some odd states over the last couple of years on the Common Core issue. But it's really great to see how much interest is being generated right here in Massachusetts, because the fact is that from the beginning, Massachusetts really had the most to lose in this whole discussion around Common Core, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So to give you a little bit of historical context, I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that the federal government, the national government, is properly directed towards foreign policy and trade and commerce and defense, but that most of the issues that most directly touch the lives of citizens and children and teachers are really the jurisdiction of the state and local governments. The U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, and that was not an accident. The Founding Fathers understood that in order to perpetuate the ideals of our republic, that local government and local civic participation needed to be the wellspring for our democracy. No institution in the history of this country has been a greater representation of that than our public schools. And so while the federal government has really a minimal role in K-12 education, even at this late date, when after 30 some odd years or so of having a U.S. Department of Education, really a small amount, about 10% of the funding for K-12 education comes from the federal government. 90% of it comes from the state and local governments. And the state constitutions, including the Massachusetts Constitution, which is the oldest written constitution in the world, it was written by John Adams in 1780, is very, very specific about it. There are paragraph after paragraph of what they call the Cherish Clause, where John Adams and the framers of the Massachusetts Constitution make it clear that it's the duty of citizens and legislators in the future to cherish the interests of literature and mathematics and science, that these groundings in the liberal arts, really, what we call the liberal arts, are the wellspring for citizenship. That is to say, the founders really understood that the point of public education is for developing citizens. It's certainly important to develop well-educated workers, but first and foremost, in our democracy and under our way of life, it's education for citizenship. And in order to be a citizen, you have to understand the rights and the duties that are implicit in being a citizen. And I would argue that this arrangement of having the federal government do the things that it does well and the state and local governments do the things that they do well is really what has taken this country from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard in the last several hundred years, made us the most powerful country in the world. It's a remarkable, remarkable ascent. But it really has been this commitment to local and state government that has been the wellspring of that. In the 1830s, there's a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville. He came to this country to find out what this democracy was all about. And he was fascinated because it was totally different from anything that he saw in France or all throughout Europe, where all of the decisions were made on high by kings and queens and czars and ministers, that citizens were really kind of recipients of ideas from people on the top. And he said, what's going on in this country, in the United States, in this democracy, and he ultimately wrote a big 2-volume book called Democracy in America, is totally different because the ideas and the commitment to self-government comes from the people themselves. And it's a revolutionary idea that even still to this day is something that some people in Washington, D.C. have a difficult time with, frankly. They think the decision should be made from Washington, D.C. But in spite of this enormous ascent that this country's experienced, it was beginning to get clear a decade or two after World War II that the country was beginning to lose its edge in K-12 education. The first example of it was in the beginning of the space race, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, that we were falling behind. And then really by 1983, there was a report called A Nation at Risk. It was commissioned by the Reagan administration about how we had really gone from among the top performing countries in the world in K-12 education, and we had fallen pretty dramatically to about 15th or 20th. But what that Nation at Risk report did not do was prescribe lots of top-down solutions from Washington, D.C., because Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives had always understood that the commitment to reforming K-12 education was going to need to happen at the state and local level. And there's been a variety of different solutions to kind of fix these problems that have really been plaguing K-12 education for decades. There's some people that say we need to have a set of national standards and testing and curriculum that are driven from Washington, D.C., and that's what they do in Europe, and that's what they do in some of the high-performing countries in the world. And then there's other people that said, no, the way to improve K-12 education is to give parents more choice and develop charter schools and vouchers and allow kids to have access to private and parochial schools of their choosing, that the competition and the parental involvement will help stimulate improvements. Well, what Massachusetts did in 1993 was really different from both of those models, but in a way it integrated some of the ideals of both. Bill Weld, who was the Republican governor in the 90s, got together with Tom Birmingham, who later became the Senate president of Massachusetts. He's a pretty liberal Democrat with a great relationship with organized labor. And the third member of this sort of trio that shaped this education reform law was a guy named Mark Roosevelt, who was the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. But he too was a pretty liberal Democrat with great relationship with organized labor. And what they did is they crafted a grand bargain that made for not only good politics, but good for good policy as well. And what it was that Massachusetts and the states, the localities were going to infuse an enormous amount of money. And we've spent about $100 billion in the last 20 years on education reform at the state and local level, in exchange for all of the difficult things that people in K-12 education had not wanted to do over the previous several decades, and that, from my point of view, had led to our decline. Specifically, We weren't going to do soft skills. We weren't going to do workforce development. We weren't going to do fuzzy math. We weren't going to do self-esteem. We were going to do high-quality academic standards based in the basics of English and math and science and history. And you're very fortunate because the woman who is the architect of those standards is sitting at the end of the table there. Her name is Sandra Stotsky, a genuine hero in my view for the work that she has done on K-12 standards, because the fact is that nobody in the country can claim to have standards that have correlated to the kind of gains we've seen here in Massachusetts. Specifically, what was in those standards that everybody across the political spectrum regarded as the best in the country was a deep commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama. And these things matter, and the reason why they matter is that the quality of the words and the vocabulary that you find in Greek myths and legends and classic fairy tales and books like Huckleberry Finn and Sherlock Holmes and the works of Charles Dickens, these are great stories that bind us together as human beings. They teach our children about friendship and about tragedy and comedy. They teach us how to be human. And that's really a big function of what it means not only to be a well-educated person, but to be a citizen, is to be human. And we know and see all examples around us all the time of how our civilization is not doing a very good job of just inculcating the basic understanding about human nature and how to treat one another. But that's what these standards in English really did and do. On the math side, they used the best examples from other high-performing states and the highest-performing countries in the world, folks like Japan and South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, all the kinds of countries that in 1983 the Nation at Risk report said you have to compete with those countries to be able to compete in the 21st century. Dr. Stotsky and the group of high-quality mathematicians and experts that she assembled on the math side said you've got to have Algebra 1 by 8th grade. That's what all the high-performing countries in the world do. Algebra 1 by 8th grade, because that's the gateway for all higher-level math. And it allows enough room then throughout high school to get kids into the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields that will allow them to go into those fields when they're in college. But you got to start earlier than the way most of the states and most of what's happened in this country over the last several decades. So these high quality standards, they were coupled with the MCAS test. Most of you folks probably know what the MCAS test, high stakes test, so that a graduation requirement actually means something, that the kids can read their diploma and it has real substance, academic substance connected to it with good standards. There's teacher testing that were aligned with the standards, so the kids and the teachers were all on the same page, same level of academic expectations for everybody. They did add some charter schools and some accountability measures in there. But it was really this money in exchange for the high quality standards and the high quality testing that has been a remarkable and historic success for this state. Specifically, there's a test called the NAEP test, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's been around for 35 or 40 years. It's a test that every state in the union takes every couple years in both reading and mathematics. There's also a NAEP test in science and civics as well. But no state in the history of this test had ever been #1 in every grade tested and in every category tested. And in 2005, Massachusetts did it. And then it did it again in 2007 and 2009 and 2011 and just a couple of months ago in 2013. I tell audiences this is really the equivalent of winning 5 World Series back to back and doing it in 4 straight games each time. It's a remarkable accomplishment. That's why when people were talking about a federal grant program called Race to the Top, it was really the race to become Massachusetts. But again, as the Nation at Risk report made clear in 1983, the goal is not just to compete with the other states in the Union. The goal in the 21st century is to compete with the highest performing countries in the world. So in 2007, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country. It was one of only 2 states in the country to do that. Minnesota was the other one, on a testing international testings in math and science called TIMSS testing. So Massachusetts in 2007 and 2013 tested as its own individual country. And guess what the results were? The results were that our 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science, and that in the area of mathematics, we were within the top 5 in the world. This is a remarkable accomplishment. If winning and scoring #1 on the NAEP test is winning a World Series, the success on this TIMSS test is like winning a couple Olympic gold medals. It's a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. It exceeds the expectations and wildest dreams of the people who wrote the education reform law just 20 years ago. I think they would never, ever could have predicted that we would have done this well, and we would have done so well so quickly. But it really is these standards, what it is that's taught and outlined by the state and what's taught by teachers in schools that matter. The level of academic expectations is really the central responsibility and goal and role of what schools are all about. There's a lot of discussions around K-12 education and schooling about, where are we gonna put the football field or the track, or who's gonna get the catering contract for lunch. These things are important, but they're much, much lower in importance than what is actually taught. The whole point of schooling is academics. That's what it's about. So, given that Massachusetts had the most to lose in this discussion around Common Core, Pioneer Institute, where I work, it's an independent think tank. It's been around for 20 years or so. We have been one of the prime movers behind a lot of the elements of the Ed Reform Act. We're big advocates of charter schools, which are independent and highly accountable public schools. We've been big advocates of school choice, that is to say, private and parochial school choice. But we've always been a big believer in academic quality, that is really what this is all about. That's what this discussion is about. So given that Massachusetts had the most to lose, we thought as researchers that our responsibility in 2009 and 2010, when Common Core came down the pike, is that we first and foremost, we thought somebody ought to take an objective, independent analysis of what it is that Common Core was all about in English and math, and how it stacked up against high standard states like Massachusetts and Minnesota and California and Texas and Indiana. So we enlisted the best experts we could find. We got Dr. Stotsky on the reading side, and then we coupled her with Jim Milgram, who's a professor of mathematics at Stanford University, who had worked on the very high quality math standards, and a guy named Zev Werman, who's a Silicon Valley engineer who also had worked on the California math standards. And we said to him, give us your honest, objective, thorough analysis of how Common Core stacks up against high standard states. And what they did, and they did 4 thorough evaluations of the 4 drafts of Common Core against the high standard states. And what they found is that at every step of the way, in these 40, 50-page crosswalks or evaluations, that Common Core was of significantly lower quality than what Massachusetts and Indiana and California and Texas and Minnesota, the high standard states, already had. Specifically, they ignored, that is to say Common Core, ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and decided to cut classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60% for Massachusetts. So the secret sauce that had been the key element to our kids doing so well in English and reading, they cut that. They started dumping what they call informational text. So it include things like Federal Reserve manuals, bureaucratic regulations from DC-based bureaucracies. There are some things in there that I think we would all agree. I mean, that are good, like the Gettysburg Address or a letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King. The problem is that Common Core's architects have said the way you read those historical documents is by ignoring all the history around it. So kids and teachers are supposed to forget that the Gettysburg Address took place in the middle of the Civil War. They're supposed to forget that Abraham Lincoln was consecrating a cemetery. They're probably even supposed to forget the first line which references back to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. They call this cold reading. It is both anti-historical, but it's also anti-intellectual. And the fact is as important as reading the Gettysburg Address or a letter from Birmingham jail is, those texts primarily belong in history classes. They are history speeches and historical documents. They certainly can be taught in English classes, but what English teachers are primarily trained to do is teach literature. That's why they went into it. That's what their training is, that's what their orientation is. And history teachers are primarily supposed to teach things like the Gettysburg Address. So, on the math side, Common Core, according to our experts, decided to push forward access to algebra, not in the 8th grade, but into 9th or early 10th grade. Common Core also decided to use an experimental form of geometry that had never been successful in any place it's been tried, including the former Soviet Union. And Common Core math really tops out at what Professor Milgram has characterized as Algebra 2 light. So if your child is interested in the STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, Common Core is really a road to nowhere. And this isn't me saying this is highly respected mathematicians, and in point of fact, even the architects, the writers of Common Core over the last several years have been quoted in newspapers, in tapes, and in testimony before the Massachusetts Department of Education saying that it does not prepare kids for STEM fields, particularly for highly competitive colleges. The goal really with Common Core is to send lots more kids to college, but in order to do that, they're going to have to dumb down the standards. And no state, in terms of academic quality, has the most to lose in this.